There's been criticism, mainly coming from Paul Keating, but also plenty of question marks around how exactly this might work. Yes, the announcement was tricky to land across 3 different governments and leaders, but implementation, well, that will be much more difficult. Joining me live now is Professor Gordon Flake, founding CEO of the Perth USASIA Centre. Thanks very much for your time. So, look, there's sort of solutions here for all 3 countries, and I'm sure that was difficult to land, but implementation, multi-decades, not just multiple countries, but we're going to have all sorts of changes of leader. It really does get tricky from now, doesn't it?
It certainly does, but we knew that from the very start. From the announcement a year and a half ago, we knew that it was going to take decades and it was going to be difficult. I have to say the announcement actually surprised me with how much it was forward delivering. The fact that by 2027 we could have an AUKUS rotational force here in Western Australia. With 3 U.S. Virginia-class submarines and a UK Astute-class submarine, it really does go a long way to addressing what you're questioning, the question of timing. And then obviously there's phasing built into it. So there is that longer-term question that everybody's fixated on, is the AUKUS-built submarines, and they're much longer term. But this is actually a much broader deal than that has not just one pillar, the submarines, but a second pillar in technology sharing, which will bear fruit far sooner than the decades that we're looking at in the future.
I suppose safeguards it as well, because you can't sort of pick and choose. It's a big, broad, encompassing deal that helps all countries in multiple ways. So I think it's a good point. Is there one thing we don't talk about is the decision itself? Not just on nuclear submarines, but so much money we're spending, assuming submarines will still be, you know, the kings or queens of the sea in 30, 40 years' time. Is there an inherent risk of how much of our defence budget this will soak up? Because I know we've heard 0.15, but when this is at its peak, it's going to be much more expensive than that.
Yeah, well, and again, these are valid concerns. It's difficult to predict what's going to happen in 5 years, let alone 40 years. At the same time, you make the best decisions you can today based on the capabilities you know you're going to require in the decades to come. And given the time frame for anything as capable and as complex as a nuclear-propelled submarine, those decisions aren't one-year decisions. They require 40 years to build a program. And that's not just true for Australia, it's true for the United States. And the United States is still producing submarines in shipyards that were built in the 1950s. And so they're multi-generational kind of programs. But the result of those decisions 40 years ago are important for and determinative of the situation we find ourselves in today. The world doesn't seem to be getting any better. We kind of thought it might, and for a long time we kind of took the pedal off the gas on these things. But I think if you look at long-term trends, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in the South China Seas, what's happening on the border with India, what's happening potentially with Taiwan, I think there's a recognition that we need to prepare ourselves for an uncertain future.
Interesting as well, I mentioned, you know, the risk in future years and governments change and leaders change. There's been a lot of focus on Donald Trump, there always is, and his sort of isolationist bent, I suppose. But it goes beyond Trump and the Republican Party, and the next most likely man to be president there, Ron DeSantis. I mean, he said, for example, on Ukraine, this is just a territorial fight. It's not a core interest for the US. Is that the concern, that it's not just as Donald Trump get elected, but the Republican Party and the sort of, you know, wrestle over power for it has plenty of people with voices saying, let's not be the world's police anymore, for want of a better description?
That is a very real concern. To have the 2 standard bearers of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, you know, a current candidate, and his most likely competitor, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, parroting Putin's lines, parroting Russian propaganda, is shocking, something that I couldn't have conceptualized a decade ago when I lived in Washington, D.C. But having said that, those statements have now kind of brought to the fore this fundamental divide within the Republican Party between the traditional national security establishment, the old John McCain wing, weak though it may be, and this kind of Trump-DeSantis wing. It's all tied into domestic politics, as you might imagine. It's not really based on an ideology. It's not based on policy, if you will. It's really based on, you know, trying to stick as close as they can to Donald Trump, given his sway over his particular voters. And it's one that I hope gets resolved before the next election. But from an Australian perspective, from a UK perspective, from a global perspective, Yeah, there's got to be some real concern about that deeply isolationist bent in what had previously been the more internationalist wing of the U.S. political spectrum.